Hello, in this section we'll see about CSS Grid layout. CSS Grid layouts module offers a grid-based layout system with rows and columns, which makes it easier to build different layouts in CSS Grid. So let's start by having some elements, and in order to create grid layout, we should have a grid container. So let's create a development having a class name of container. Then let's have some development class of having class of item, and let's have item 1, and let's copy this one to around 9 times, and the last one for 9. Now if you see this container, there is no style applied for the container, so simply we see a div items. Now let's apply some grid style sheets. So for the container we use some style, so let's have style tag, then dots container. Of display we use grid. So the first step is to put a grid style, and we put a grid template columns, which tells us the number of columns. So we need 4 columns, so we put for auto, for 3 columns, so we need that 3 by 3 grid elements having background color of blue violet and a padding of 20 pixels for inside text. So that is enough for the container. And for the child container on direct children, we give a property of background color of tomato as always, and the other border of 1 pixel, solid and not orange, simply black, and a padding of 20 pixels. Now if you refresh this, we see that a 3 by 3 grid elements. So by simply giving the display grid and grid template columns to auto, you can define the size, which means it evenly divides the space. So we can arrange or give spaces, so we'll see it later. So simply by giving a display of grid and identifying the number of columns, that is 3, we arrange or we create a grid element. So in grid elements, there is a display grid, and we can say that grid columns. So as you see, item 1, item 4, and item 7 are in one column. Item 2, 5, and 8 are the other column, and 3, 6, and 9 are the other column. So these are, we call them columns, and rows are item 1, 2, and 3 are rows, 7, 8, and 9 are another rows. So grid items can be divided into grid columns and grid rows. The same way we can divide gaps into row gap and column gap. So in order to define the gap between 2 elements, we can use the column gap of some pixel. For example, let's have here column, as you see, column gap of 20 pixels. Now if we refresh, as you see, we get column gap of 20 pixels in each column. We can also have a row gap of 10 pixels, for example. Now we get space around or a gap around rows. So we use column gap or row gap in order to arrange those spaces. We can also we can use a gap property which holds row gap and column gap at the same time. So if we want to use one property for both of them, we use gap. Then first one is row gap, that is 10 pixels, and the second one is column gap, that is 20 pixels. So we can give and we get the same effect. So that is how we use the gap property in grid layout elements. Grid lines. The grid line between columns are called column lines. As we see here, we have the first line, the second line, the third and the fourth lines. And the line between rows, we call them row lines. We have the first, second, third, and fourth row lines. So we can merge these grid lines in order to create or merge two columns, or to merge more than two columns. Also, we can also merge a number of rows to create one row. So in that case, we use the grid column start property and grid column end property for columns, and grid row start and grid row end property for rows. So let's have grid column start and grid column end property for the first element, and let's see their effect. So for the first element here, we apply the grid column start and grid column end property in order to merge and create a two row item. So let's first simply remove the last item, since the first item takes the 2. So let's say it's item 1, and for item 1 dots item 1, let's create grid column start at 1 and grid column end at 3. Now let's see the difference. Here, as we see, column 1 only takes one row, and it's the start line is at this point, grid column 1, 2, and 3. So the two rows, item 1 and here, both rows or both columns are handled by or held by item 1. So if you refresh now, as you see, item 1 takes two rows, two columns, and the rest of the items hold the other areas. So grid column start and grid column end is to adjust or hold columns. The same way we can arrange, for example, for item 3, we can use grid row start and grid row end properties. So let's change, for example, this item 1 column into row start at 1 and row start at end at 3. So now, if you refresh, we get 1, 2. So 1 and 3 will be merged, and the rest will continue. So as you see, row 1 and 3 will be merged together. So we can merge rows in this way. That is how we use grid row start and grid row column start properties in grid elements. So the grid columns property here, as we apply here, we apply the auto 3 columns. So we adjust it to auto, which means divide the space evenly to all 3 columns, which defines the number of columns in your grid layout. Also, it can define the width of each column. So we can define or differentiate the width of each column. So we can give the width, for example, here we can give the first element to 80 pixels or 100 pixels, the other to 300 pixels, and the third one to auto. So the rest of the column will be applied to the third element. Now, if you remove this one for the time being, if you comment this one, and if you add another element, number element 9, to see the difference. So if you refresh, as you see, the first element takes only 100 pixels, the second one is 300 pixels, and the third one, the rest of the elements. So we can also define it to be simply 500 pixels. So the length of the third column decreases. If you make it auto, it takes the rest of the space. So that is how we use grid template columns in grid container. The other is grid template rows. So if you have number of rows, we can adjust that grid template rows, or we can define that property. So let's see. Here we have 3 rows. So as a result, grid template rows. So for the 3 elements, we can adjust auto, or we can have 100 pixel, 300 pixel, and 100 pixel. Now if we refresh, as you see, the first one and the third row are 100 pixel, the second is 300 pixels, and the third one is 10 pixel, or we can make it to 150. So we can arrange in this way, or we can make it, if you want to space it evenly, you can use simply auto, and auto. So in this way, we can arrange our columns. The other important property is the justify content property. Justify content property is to define. Justify content property is to align the whole grid inside the container. So the horizontal alignment of the container is managed by justify content property. So we can use here, for example, justify content to center. So all of the grid items will be centered as the center. As you see, the grid item is centered, or the grid container is centered. The grid items will be centered to the center of the container. The other, we can put space evenly, space around. So between the columns we get spaces. We can also space evenly. And they get space evenly between grid columns. So center space evenly, space between are possible values for the justify content property of the item. So we can give it to start, for example. So the alignment status on the left side, we can make it end, so that it starts at the end or right side properties. The other property is the align content property. You vertically align the whole grid inside the container. So in order, if you want to align vertically, you use align content property. So we can have also align content property to start or end, for example. So if you make this, it starts at the end. And in order to see here, we may increase the size of the container to 200 pixels or more than that. So the height to be 500 pixels. Now if we refresh, we get that the align content property pushes the items to the bottom, since we put it to the end. As we see here, we put the align content property to the end and justify content to the end. So the first one, justify content, pushes to the right side, and the align content to the bottom. We can change this one to, for example, make it center, justify content, so that we get it at the center and at the bottom. If we make both of them to center, we get the item in the middle, as you see. So that is how we vertically align and horizontally align by using align contents to vertically align and justify content to horizontally align grid items. So possible values for align content is space around, space between, space evenly are possible values. So let's see the difference. Space around, one possibility, so that we get space around rows of grid items. Space evenly, another possibility. So that is the space evenly, and space between is another possibility. So that is how we use align content property. So for grid items, we can define the grid column property. Previously, we see about grid column start and grid column end for grid items. So let's have an item one here, the item one element, item one. Then for this element, let's have grid column start of 1. It starts at column 1 and grid column end of 3, which means it spans 3 or 2 columns. So now we have to remove this one, the last one, since the first one takes 2. Now if you refresh by remove, first let's remove this one, justify content and 2 elements in order to see it correctly. So as you see here, the grid item 1 spans 2 columns, column items, the first column and the third column. So line 1, 2 and 3. So this is how we span 2 elements. But there is shorthand form for this one. We can use a grid column property simply. Then we put 1, that is the start, slash 3 for the end. Now we can remove or comment out those elements, and if we refresh, we see the same effect. The other alternative properties for the row 1, we use grid row property. So simply we use, instead of column, we use row, grid row start at 1, grid row end at 3. So row 1 and 2 are merged together so that we get 1 column. That is how we use grid column and grid row properties for grid items. Thank you.